It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, joining us today in a library, believe it or not, which is the last place you would expect to find this outdoor adventurer that we've got on the show today, is Steve Cannon. And if you haven't heard about Steve Cannon, let me read this to you. It says, Steve Cannon runs, he fat bikes, kayaks, and skis. He would doubt that he'd call himself a runner, biker, kayaker, or skier, however. He would most likely refer to himself as an adventurer. Steve's run over nearly 100 marathons and has taken on the world's longest kayak race. In 2004, he rode his bike to the starting line of the Deadwood-Mickelson Trail Marathon in South Dakota. That began in Iowa, here in the heartland, before running the marathon and continuing on another 1,900 miles and 38 days. This guy's completed over 20 RAGBRAIs. We've talked about that a little bit on the show. 8 gravel world championships in Nebraska. Steve, I'm assuming gravel championships, that's gravel bike riding?
You got it.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of... Hey, tell me something. What do you do about the dogs on those gravel roads? That was what I encountered that I really hated, was the farm dogs that would come out and chase you down the gravel roads. Did you have a problem with that?
It's similar to the rules in Alaska when you're dealing with grizzly bears.
Yeah.
You don't have to be the slowest, or the fastest rather. You just don't want to be the slowest.
Yeah.
Make sure there's somebody behind you when the dogs start chasing.
Yeah, because that's what happened to me out on the gravel roads. He's been on 4 Ride the Rockies. He's made it 5 times to the Dirty Kanza 200, earning the coveted 1,000 miles of Kanza Goblet in 2017. He was the second person to run the 292 miles across his home state of Iowa in 11 days, averaging a marathon distance each day, and is the first person ever to run around the Great Lake of Michigan, logging 1,037 miles in 40 days. And just now here recently, in 2018, Steve completed the Iditarod Trail. That's a 350 mile bike race, and one of the reasons we're talking to him today, this year he completed that 1,000 mile Iditarod Trail Invitational. So that maybe is the latest feather in his cap, although maybe he's done something since then, but we're going to get caught up. And I don't know, Steve, the best way to get caught up maybe is to start at the beginning, to introduce yourself to our audience. How did this all start? Where did this all begin?
Well, first of all, George, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
For having me on here. It's surreal to have these opportunities. A small town kid from southeast Iowa, and now our real speaking point to people, and it has been for a while, but the message really is, what's your Iditarod? And for me, my most recent Iditarod actually was the Iditarod. Yeah. But when you talk about where it all started for me, in earnest, it started when I got out of jail. I had 2 drunk drivings. My life was going nowhere. I was in my late 20s. And so my first Iditarod, if you will, was to just get sober, was to just get clean. And to date, it's still the biggest challenge that I've ever taken on, and the scariest challenge that I've ever taken on. But successfully getting that accomplished set the table for all the adventures that you just listed.
And God, what a list, what a lineup. The one thing that I did want to mention, now those adventures, they've raised nearly $700,000 for Livestrong, Camp Kesem, and Above and Beyond Cancer. And we've already had Above and Beyond Cancer on the podcast. We talked to our good friend Chris Goodale just a few weeks ago about that organization. So was that a motivating factor for you? Did you always intend to want to raise money for organizations like this when you first started?
Well, now I can say we're a little closer to 800,000.
Ah, attaboy.
We've produced a documentary on the Iditarod Trail Invitational, and the monies raised during that race, as well as the movie, are continuing to contribute to another great cancer charity, Leukemia Lymphoma Society. So that's exciting. I can't say that it was all that altruistic. When I decided to run across Iowa, I had a selfish reason for wanting to raise money for a charity, and that was I didn't want to quit. I wanted to make sure I could make it, and I thought I'd really up my chances if I was doing it for something bigger than myself. And so at that time, Lance Armstrong was kicking ass on the bicycle, and the Livestrong Foundation was huge, the yellow bracelet, all of that. And so I thought, why not? People will recognize it. So that was really the reason. But what happened is at the start in Council Bluffs the night before, I had a husband and wife ask me if we could chat a little bit after our pre-run kickoff, if you will. And they shared a story about their 11-year-old son who they'd recently lost to cancer. And it was gut-wrenching, life-changing, joyous. I mean, everything happened in that conversation. But for me, that became the point where I realized, okay, this is going to be what I do. I'm going to take my love of adventure and I'm going to use it to benefit others. Because what happened over the course of those 11 days across Iowa is, through the stories and people I met, I got all the benefits of having cancer without having to have cancer. I got to learn all the lessons, the value of a hug, the value of every day, the value that you can wake up tomorrow and a loved one or yourself can be put on notice. And so all of those things that you listed off, that's how I repay.
Yeah. And running across, how do you choose a route? I mean, when people think going across Iowa, well, we think the interstate system. But if you're out there running, it's probably not the interstate, right?
It's not the interstate. And as you mentioned, I was the second person to ever do so. Rusty Bishop was the first person to ever do so. And he had followed the Ragbri, or a good portion of the Ragbri route. I chose what I saw the shortest distance between 2 points, which was to pretty much parallel Interstate 80, just to the south of it. Highway 92 goes pretty much cross-state. I wasn't on that all the time, but the highway system stayed pretty close to that, and so that was how I chose the route. And then, obviously, every 25 to 30 miles, I'd try to make sure I was somewhere where I could find a hotel or a place to lay my head for a few hours.
Yeah. Now, compare and contrast that to Alaska. Yeah, and I did it right because I ride a bike a little bit, nothing like what you do, but I hate being out on the roads and the highways and that. I just don't like the danger element of it.
Correct. Same.
Yeah,
it's what leads me to the gravel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it can be dangerous, so too.
It can, but it's the car to bike ratio is about 10,000 to 1 versus being on the highway versus the gravel roads.
Right.
And you can hear the vehicles coming, you can see them coming. And for the most part, although you'll get the occasional F-150 that tells you you're number one, they're only going to give you a little dusting. So
yeah,
I'm the same. I don't like to be on the roads.
Time of year, when do you do it?
Always.
Yeah.
There's no bad weather, just bad gear choices.
Yeah. And do your adventures themselves keep you in shape, or do you have to condition every day to do this type of thing?
Well, it's a lifestyle. I try to make sure that it doesn't become a job. And so instead of just going to the treadmill or hopping on the stationary bike, which are things I enjoy, I love getting my blood going. I love the feeling of being alive. And it's also exciting to just load up your bike and say, you know what, let's just go so many miles this way and throw our tent down, and so many miles this way and throw our tent down. And sometimes that's a couple days and sometimes it's longer than that. But through the course of adventure, you can also find yourself getting pretty fit.
Now, this Iditarod race, people have heard about that. Heard about the sled dogs. Using that route. I was not aware that it was being raced by guys on bicycles and a fat bike, right? These are the bikes with the fat tires they're off-road bikes. Tell us about that.
That's right. They're the fat bike tires, which most people have an idea of now. You see them around. They're 4 or 5 inch tires. And you're exactly right. A lot of people know of the Iditarod from the sled dog race that began in 1973. And in the last 17 years, there's been a human-powered version. So people can attempt it on foot, ski, or fat bike. And so it's the entirety of the trail, the full 1,000 miles that the dogs do. The dogs actually start a week after us. They catch us at some point, and you get to share the trail with those dogs, which is surreal, out in the middle of the backcountry of Alaska to be with those animals and those mushers. It's really quite something. So yeah, that's the most recent accomplishment, and we finished that. Started February 25th, finished towards the end of March. You have 30 days.
Yeah, and the photography that you did it in the winter. I mean, I'm seeing, like you say, right before the dogs. Why in the wintertime?
The trail doesn't exist other than in the winter.
Oh, I see.
So it's a mishmash of rivers and lakes, and there are some sections of the trail that exist, but in its entirety, it only exists because of the freezing conditions, and that's what makes it the race that it is. In the 17 years they've had the race, I believe 56 people so far have successfully completed it in total.
Well, since this is your most recent accomplishment, let's talk about that a little bit. Give us a description here. I mean, we got a couple of minutes. Tell us about your race.
Imagine the most beautiful, most remote bluebird sky, frozen trail, smile so broad across your face it hurts, and then contrast that with what you would think would be the most miserable day you could possibly have, the Yukon River melting underneath your tires, grizzly bears being up earlier than they've ever been up in history, thinking you're going to be at a destination in 5 or 6 hours, and then the trail just disappearing and you push your bike for 40 miles. So it's all of that. It's the very best. It's the very worst. It takes you to as high as you could imagine, and at times absolutely as low as or lower than you probably thought you were capable of enduring.
Are the circumstances for this race changing? Is climate change having a role or a factor in this? Did you encounter, let's say you had done this race 20 years ago, would it have been different than when you did it?
There's no doubt about it. We've had this discussion. We've had a couple movie screenings and things of that nature, and the questions come up because the Yukon River was melting while we were doing the race. The sea ice on the Bering Sea was disappearing earlier than anyone had ever seen it. Not anyone in the last 20 years, anyone. In Alaska, in the places where it's really cold, there would be no debate about climate change. You walk in and try to debate that, Republican, Democrat, no political affiliation whatsoever, they'd laugh you out of the room. Now, you could debate reasons, cures, things of that nature, but there's no doubt. I mean, it got to 27 below one night. I've lived in Alaska the last 2 winters, so that didn't seem like a big deal to me. But even 5 or 10 years ago, that wasn't considered cold. That was just considered January. It's not the case anymore.
Let's take just a break here. I gotta get the kid out of there. I can hear him in my headphones out here in the hallway. Hi, buddy. Who are you with? Can you move him away from the door here? Thanks. See, I can fix this in post, so don't worry about it. I'll just edit that portion out, but I was hearing that kid. A little bit of it's okay, but I don't want to hear it through the whole interview. Okay, so the other thing is I'm always interested in the media side of this. Were there photographers, photojournalists along on this route also to catch what you were doing?
Not much. The trail is fairly inaccessible other than by bush plane. So the past years, they've had a bush plane pilot who is available for emergencies if people have to abandon the race, to also take some photos. As I mentioned to you, with permission and collaboration from the race directors, we made a documentary this year. But even in that case, they don't want photojournalists, photographers along the trail, whether it be by snowmobile or whatever the case, because It can degrade the trail. It's a self-supported race. You carry everything on there. So there's some issues there. So you will get some photography because someone would fly into Iditarod, for example, at mile 450, and they'd hang out, and they'd get photos coming and going. Or a bush plane may drop in here, and that photographer may have permission to be there. But as far as following the event, that sort of thing, that doesn't happen.
As I mentioned earlier, it's known previously, everybody thinks of it as a sled dog race, and one of the reasons is, we used to think anyway, maybe the snowmobiles being the exception, but you needed a sled dog to traverse it, to make the route. How well suited is the fat bike to that? How does it compare to a sled?
It depends on the conditions. It can be quicker than the dogs. Now, and I say that only because they hold the dogs back. If those dogs were allowed to do what they want to do, they'd run full out 15 to 20 miles an hour, and in 10 or 20 miles, whatever the case may be, then they'd lay down. So the dogs are very much on a trot, and they're going 4, 5, 6 miles an hour, where if the trail's frozen and it's good and cold, we may go 8 to 10, maybe even 11, 12 miles an hour. But when the trail goes bad or that it disappears, that becomes 1 mile an hour, and it's quite brutal.
Well, you mentioned when the trail disappears. How do you know you're on the trail?
Well, there's two things that happen. One is they have a GPS route from years past that you will load into your own GPS. And then two, there is a trail breaking crew which leads out the dog sled race to make sure that the lead dog team doesn't have to break trail, because that'd be an unfair advantage. So they get ahead of the dog teams and they come out. And you mentioned the snowmobiles as well. So there's a race called the Iron Dog, and it's a race along the same trail, not too short before that. And they, every 100 yards to 200 yards, put a piece of wood lath and push it into the ground. So you have a couple situations there, but there are times when Alaska decides to be Alaska and you encounter ground blizzards where I'd barely be able to see you and you're 3 feet from me.
Yeah. So the movie, what's it going to be like? What's the nature of what's the focus of the movie?
The movie's called 1,000 Miles to Nome, and it's a documentary that begins with giving the history of the trail, because you're a perfect example of 90% of the people that know about the Iditarod Trail. Most of them don't know about the Iditarod Trail Invitational or the human-powered event. So we wanted to give the history of that and how that came to be. Not only the dog sled race, but the human-powered race. And then it's a documentary about 4 athletes that are attempting this distance. 2 of them on bicycle and 2 of them on foot, and their journeys, highs, lows, and everything in between along the way.
So you're one of the 4.
I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how'd you make the choice between foot and bike? I mean, are you going to do it are you going to run it also someday, or how do you decide which to do?
It's a good question. I think it's just a matter of when the race finds you. Had the race found me 10 years ago when I was beating it around Lake Michigan and running marathons and doing all of that, it would have been right in my wheelhouse. Not long after the Lake Michigan run, then I'd got back to getting on the bike and haven't run as much, and that's when winter found me, and I fell in love with it, and winter pursuits have really been the focus of what I love to do for the last 4 or 5 years now.
Yeah, this is a great. I mean, I want people to go see the movie, so I don't want to, give it all away or talk about it too much.
That's all right. I won't give you. I'll give you just enough to be dangerous.
Well, whenever you discuss humanity, almost, it's kind of funny, because I did a podcast recently for Above and Beyond Cancer, and I went to one of their presentations, and this doctor of oncology was saying that it's proven. There are all kinds of studies. There's all kinds of research. There's no doubt that exercise has immense benefit for anybody that's been diagnosed with cancer. And he said, when someone's diagnosed, he says 95% of the time when they come up to me and they want to know what they can do or what should they change in their life to enhance their opportunities for survival with cancer, they don't talk about exercise. They talk about food. What do I eat? The food element is a little less known. It's not as precise. It's not as scientific. There's not as much research. They don't know. They don't have as good an answer for that. I mean, there's some things they think you should do and you shouldn't do, but there's all this research on exercise. Nobody wants to talk about exercise because they don't want to do it. So it reminded me that, like when you meet somebody from another country or something, what do you eat? What kind of food do they have when you travel about? It's always focusing on food. So I know that's going to be of interest. It's always a question you can ask. You're out there on the trail. Do you bring your own food? What do you eat? Beef jerky, or what do you got for food out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. The race, as I'd mentioned, is self-supported. So, there's no Casey's out there.
Yeah.
So there's two things that you do. One is you pack a damn lot of food, and we'll chat just a second about that. And then the second is there's villages, some inhabited, some uninhabited, along the trail. So 2 weeks before the race, you actually mail yourself 5-pound boxes of food. That's the limit. That's the size box they give you. I wrote nice little motivational notes on mine because I knew I needed Happy Steve to meet whatever Steve it might be that's showing up on the trail.
That's neat, yeah.
And then I used a company called Expedition Foods. They specialize in freeze-dried foods. Their menu is quite extensive, quite healthy. They actually have an entire line that's called 1,000-calorie meals. Most of them are in the 600 to 700 calories, and so eating enough is a real challenge. And then I had happy foods. I had chocolate, and I had Reese's peanut butter cups, and I had and then I had some homemade things as well. I had some homemade breads, really dense breads that are decades old that were used by mountaineer summiters that you just pack with all kinds of good things, and some homemade power balls with oats and all of these kind of things. And then, man, you just keep feeding it in. It's impossible to eat enough. I lost over 20 pounds during the journey.
Mm. And I can tell just by looking at the information, your website, and meeting with you and talking with you, this maybe, I don't know if this was the crown jewel for you, but this was a big deal as far as your career is concerned and what you're doing. What now? I got a feeling you're not a guy that is rest on his laurels kind of a guy. What's up next for you, or have you decided yet?
Well, the movie's been a big swing. It's something that I've never dealt with before, so we're learning a lot. The movie is going to be a tremendous fundraising tool for the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. We've had 2 showings here in town, one for donors that helped us make the movie, and then another public showing at Franklin Junior High, which is a great new little venue just down the street from where we're doing this.
Yeah.
250 came out to see the movie there. But you're right. This is a huge accomplishment for me. It's been the focus of my life for over 4 years now. I've moved to Alaska the last 2 winters, lived in a cabin out in the sticks just to train for this, to give myself every chance to complete it. But I'm no different than you or anybody else that's listening to this. Nobody sits on their laurels. It's just not possible. As human beings, when we accomplish something, we always are looking for the next thing. It's what we do. We're expansion creatures. There's no finish line. The Iditarod was a finish line. It's not the finish line. It's now just a starting line. And for me, it's really exciting. I think, what if this huge thing that I just accomplished isn't such a huge thing? What if it's only scratching the surface of what I'm capable?
Yeah.
And that's the journey I'm interested in.
Well, that's great. Well, good on you. I mean, this would be a wonderful story if you were just doing this for yourself. I mean, it's a great thing. But you're not. You're doing it for all of these organizations and groups and these fundraising, and you mentioned the movie's going to be a great means of doing that. And, I listened to kind of the word picture that you paint about being out there on the trail. I'm never going to do that. I mean, my day of doing that, if it ever existed, is long gone. It ain't happening for me. And for a lot of our listeners, they won't be able to go do it themselves either. But they can kind of go with you. I mean, they can go along with you on these journeys. They can participate. They can contribute. They can be a part of this. Tell us about that. Tell us how they can do that.
Well, that's it, man. I mean, Our website is expandyourpossible.com. What's Your Iditarod is really our rallying cry right now. So there's a couple different things. You go to the website if you enjoy the movie. If you just purchase the movie, you're going to help somebody's life, because every download, it's not available yet, but it will be in the upcoming weeks. Every download is going to go to benefit Leukemia Lymphoma Society. But beyond that, it's really about all of us together. What can we do as far as inspiring each other, right? You said it. You're never going to go to Alaska. You're never going to go to do the Iditarod. But you know what? There's things that you can do that I can't ever do. We all have unique talents. This is about creating a community and inspiring each other to chase your own Iditarod. What that might be, hey, my first race was a 5K in Manitou Springs, and I was scared to death. I didn't have spandex. I wasn't in shape. I just knew I'd finally got sober. I wanted to start to get in shape. I showed up there. That was my Iditarod, getting off the couch, getting out to meet people. You know, it may be becoming a better parent. It may be signing up to do the, Ironman 70.3 that's coming to Des Moines. It doesn't matter. It just matters that you find something that scares you, that motivates you, and then you go for it.
Wow. I'm the podcaster, Steve, but that's the closer. That's well said. That's well done, my friend. That's great stuff. And he's a perfect example of what I want to continue to bring forward on this podcast. This is a guy with talent and skill and ability that deserves to be promoted and uplifted, and that's what we're doing on a podcast by George. I want to thank everybody for listening, and to seek us out on all of the various platforms that we mentioned. Listen in to Podcast by George, and I wish Steve all the best. This is great stuff. A guy from Southeast Iowa, believe it or not, that's a world adventurer now, doing all of these great accomplishments and sharing his story with us on another podcast by George.